The first chapter of your novel is probably chapter 1, unless you have a prologue or a foreword or an introduction or something. But chapter 1 could also be the last chapter that readers read. There are all kinds of issues within a first chapter that will make readers give up before even getting to the second chapter. Sure, a lot of people will probably give a novel a couple of chapters before they give up on it, but even for these folks, if you have any of the issues we're talking about today in chapter 1, it will make them less likely to stick around. So today, let's talk about some of the issues that your novel can have that will make readers quit after the first chapter. Are people still watching this? All right, first reason readers quit at chapter 1, you didn't give them anything to anticipate in chapter 2. You have to get a reader to start reading your novel. That's definitely a challenge. But you also need to get them to keep reading. This is arguably one of the most critical aspects of storytelling. If I finish chapter 1 and nothing compelling has been set up, or there isn't an interesting question that I have, if I'm not curious about anything, or if I don't have any direction for where the story is going, then why would I stick around? The only thing that really makes someone read chapter 2 is what you do in chapter 1. When a character manufactures a crime scene with a knife in chapter 1, we can be pretty sure the detectives are going to show up in chapter 2. If our lovesick protagonist spots a potential love interest on page 2 of chapter 1, then page 1 of chapter 2 may have them approaching them. These are the kinds of things that give a reader direction and something to expect in the second chapter, and when they have some direction or something to expect in the second chapter, they'll probably read it. You don't need to introduce your entire plot or the main conflict of the story in chapter 1. You just need to give the reader some kind of a direction. As long as they understand that there's something worth reading chapter 2 for, then they probably will read chapter 2. Next reason readers quit at chapter 1 before getting to chapter 2, anything that is too confusing. This should be clear by now, but the most important thing in the opening of a story is clarity. The reader needs to be able to follow what's going on. Confusion will lead someone to not connect with a book and put it down in a hurry. This does not mean that everything needs to be explained. That's not a feasible thing to do in chapter 1 without several metric tons of info dumping. The reader can have questions, and they should have questions, but they should be able to understand at least a thread of what's going on. You can start with a really confusing, chaotic scene, like having a bunch of lightning raining down on a village and lots of fire and people running around, and not explain why this is happening. There's a difference between a reader experiencing something that's confusing and being confused because they don't know what they're experiencing. An opening needs to ground the reader in the story, and the best way to do that most of the time is clarity. A lack of clarity and surpluses of confusion, especially when the reader realizes that they aren't supposed to be confused, that will make people stop at chapter 1. Next reason your first chapter can become the last chapter that readers read: unconfirmed assumptions or expectations. Any reader is going to have expectations about a story before they even start reading it. They've usually read the blurb, they've seen the cover, they might even have read reviews or heard stuff about the story. This knowledge is going to create expectations, and if chapter 1 completely doesn't live up to those expectations, or makes the reader feel like those expectations will not be met, then the reader may be put off. When they pick up your book, it's because something has been promised to them. Chapter 1 needs to at least hint in some way that that promise is going to be delivered on. If there's a dragon featured prominently on the cover of your book, then there should probably be a dragon in chapter 1, or at least chapter 1 should not make the reader feel like, oh, this book definitely doesn't have dragons in it. If you've promised that dragons are going to be a pivotal part of your story, then the reader needs to feel like they are a pivotal part of the story at the end of chapter 1. I think this is why prologues are so common, because they let you do things like have a scene with dragons in it and then open on, the protagonist living their dull life in a farm or something, and then have dragons not appear until chapter 10. Prologues are an easy way to validate reader expectations because they let you jump ahead in the story or show things that aren't necessarily part of the plot at the opening of the story. Again, this is more about creating the feeling in the reader that these promises are going to be met than it is about actually delivering on the promises. An exception to this could be that if you don't give the reader what they are expecting, but the alternative you do give them is compelling enough that they stick around anyway, that can work. That's kind of the basis of most plot twists, but that's probably something that's harder to pull off. The reader needs to feel like they are starting to get what they expect out of the book in chapter 1. If chapter 1 signals very strongly that they aren't going to get those things, then they won't stick around until chapter 2. Next reason readers quit at chapter 1, your chapter 1 is too long. This is a relatively short hot take on my part here. I think there is a compelling argument to have a relatively short first chapter. I think having a shorter first chapter will generally improve your novel. You have a moment in the story that's very brief, but delivers all the things that we've talked about in as succinct a way as possible and does everything that you need to do in a first chapter. Now, this is arguably true of every chapter in a novel. No part of your story should drag on longer than it needs to. Any part of your story is going to have an optimal length to tell it in, and you should make sure that every chapter is tailored to that optimal length. What this means, though, is that you should tailor the length of chapter 1's story beat to be as short as you can. The faster you can get a reader through, here's a character and here's something compelling that's happening to them that will be dealt with in chapter 2 and in the rest of the book, the better. A short first chapter means that you've really focused on that moment and you've really tightened up the introduction. Shorter probably means simpler as there's less going on. Shorter means less information getting delivered, which means there's less opportunity for reader confusion. There's also probably a psychological aspect to this because if I get through chapter 1 really quickly, then that means it feels like I'm making a lot of progress through the novel, so maybe that helps a reader stick with it. I don't think this means that chapter 1 should be super short, but maybe that it should fall into the shorter end of the overall length distributions of all of your chapters. Like chapter 1 doesn't necessarily have to be short, but it should be a short chapter relative to all of the other chapters in your novel based on the average length of other chapters and that sort of thing. Maybe that's true. I will freely admit that this short chapter 1 is a good thing is a bit of a theory on my part. I can say with more certainty, though, that you will definitely do not want a long, drawn-out chapter 1 that feels like it goes on for way too long. That is something that will definitely make readers quit. Speaking of long, drawn-out things that have gone on for way too long, also speaking of quitting, we're at the end of this video. So there you have it. I'd love to hear about the stuff that makes you quit reading a novel after one chapter in the comments down below. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.